Good morning, everyone, and you're very welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. We're into May, so John, we're hoping things are looking upward. With John Maher from the Grass10 team, as always, to give us a quick update, and that will be followed then by Pat Tuohy, and we're going to have a discussion around Grazing Success, and I suppose the conversation really around the Heavy Soils Programme and how those farmers manage. So, John, we kick it off with you. What's happening around the country? What's the situation like?
Well, I suppose, James, you go back to last weekend, a big change in the weather now. Things have turned. So, last weekend came good in terms of temperature, big stir and growth rates. Now, there was pockets of heavy rainfall in parts of the country, I think, but all in all, things have turned, James. We went through a rough March, cold April, but things have turned now. And the figures from pasture base, say that like the average farm cover now is 750. We grew almost 60, and that's right on target for the end of April, early May. So I think there's been a turn, and it's turned for the better, right? So I suppose there are challenges though. When the average farm cover 750, we're slightly higher than we would like to be, I suppose. But people were nervous. I can understand that. I suppose, James, the big thing now is that, the stem is going to come. And if you go into the wrong pre-grazing yield, then you're going to have more stem in the diet. That brings, challenges in terms of clean out, subsequent sward quality, reduced cow performance. So while the average farm cover 750 and the growth has got to 60, and the predictions for this week are 65 to 70 for the country, the average pre-grazing yield in all the grass courses myself or John or Joe do is 1700. So that's okay for this week, but next week that would need to come down to 1400 fairly fast, because stem will come, and when you're in above 1400, the stem proportion starts, accumulating very fast, and then you don't get the graze out, and there's challenges in terms of performance. The animal, they will probably milk okay, but the proteins won't rise. They're heavily linked now to payment bonuses. So you just need to get this right. And I suppose that's the main challenge, James, is to get back into 1400 for pre-grazing yield. Mm-hmm. I suppose the other thing, if the prediction is 65 to 70, we get on a 20-day rotation. If you do the numbers, 20 by 65 is about 1300. Plus the 50 or 100 left, that's behind the residual. That's the numbers. That's how it works. So that's what you're trying to get back to. Two other things then, James, before I take a question from you, maybe. The weather this week there's a bit of rain around, ranging from over an inch in the south and north to probably a half inch in the east. Mm. So it's a good chance to do a bit of oversowing with clover. I know we're moving on from April into May, but there's a chance there to still oversow because things got a bit delayed in April with weather. And I suppose the last thing is, a lot of people purchased fertilizer, back last summer, last autumn, without sulfur. We need to keep that in mind to get the best out of nitrogen from whatever source, be it fertilizer, slurry, soil, whatever the case may be, clover. You need sulfur in the system. A lot of people have been spreading fertilizer without sulfur. Now is the time to start, if you haven't started, and you'd need to start to get the best out of it. So, the target's about, 15, 16 units by the 1st of July, early July. If you start now, you'll get most of the way. So they're the quick few points, James, if that's all right.
When we are on it there, John, fertilizer for the month of May, where are we at in terms of recommendations?
Yeah, sure. Look, the restrictions on fertilizer are coming, and they're going to get tighter. There's no denying that, right? So, we're supposed to be, for most farms, about 80 units between fertilizer and slurry from, going from January, February, March, April, about that now. A lot of dry farms have reached that, right? If you're on, Pat's going to talk about the heavy soils farms. So if you're on a heavy soils farm, it's more like, 50 or 60, because, you just don't get to do the things early on, and that makes sense. So, but from now on, then I would say, 3/4 a unit for the rotation. So 15, 60 units if you've got your 80 out. If you haven't got your 80 out between fertilizer and slurry by now, you might go to 20. All right, I accept that. But that's the numbers. No more. It's not more than a unit a day, and it's more like a 3/4 unit a day.
Okay. And come here, the other one is, we've seen bits issues last year in terms of surplus chem in early May. It was kind of left, we don't want to make bales, we're gonna put it in with the first cut. First cut then was delayed till the end of May. talk to me, like people, if surpluses are rising, should they be taking it? What's...
Yeah, I will say, James, like the dry matters this week have come back between 17 and 19 now. So, you know, that gives me hope about making pails, James, to be honest. Now, the weather is going to turn broken, but, you know, I can live with grazing 16 or 1700 for the next week, James, but after that, you're going to run to stem. I hope the weather return then, and whatever surplus is there then, that's made into bales. There are a lot of, you know, bare pits and walls, bare walls, back walls to be seen. So whatever surplus can be taken should be taken. Some can be diverted for pit silage. I don't deny that. If you want the grass back fast or paddocks back fast, you'll bale it. If you don't want, and if you have extra land or the stocking rate's lower, then you can decide to divert it for pit silage. Admit that. Some people are deciding to reseed, James, which is not the worst decision in the world, right? To increase the stocking rate to get things right in terms of demand and growth. And some people actually have the heifers at home on the block for the first 3 weeks of breeding, and that can do a job too in terms of surplus, you know. So there are options there. Yeah.
Very good, John. Look, thanks a million. I think that gives us a good synopsis, as you say, positivity in the fact that growth rates have jumped and projected to continue to do so over the coming weeks. So
that is the case, and it's about reacting to it, James. That's what I said.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as you said, going into the right grass,
trying to get into those 1300-1400s as soon as possible.
Because the stem will come. It will come.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that, John, and we'll hear from one of the team next week. Thanks,
James.
So yes, folks, as I say, we have for the remainder of the webinar, we've Pat Tuohy. Pat's a researcher in Teagasc and Maher Park, and Pat has been involved, I think, Pat, from the very start of the Teagasc Heavy Soils Programme. So we're not going to ask your age, but that's running a little while now, Pat. But I suppose just give us, look, we're going to get into the grass and the graze and maybe a little bit more, but give us just a little bit in terms of Teagasc Heavy Soils Programme, a wee bit of an intro and background. What is it?
Yeah, it's no bother, James. I suppose I wasn't there from the very, very start, but most of the time. Look, I suppose from the research point of view, the program was set up a good number of years ago to look at the limitations associated with managing heavy soils. It's estimated about a third of the milk pool is coming from heavy soils or difficult soils. And try and demonstrate methods then to improve productivity, improve utilization of those soils, decrease the volatility that would be associated with weather, well, with mostly rainfall in terms of weather on those soils, and provide another, I suppose, staging post really outside of the research farms, which tend typically to be on the better soils in the country and in drier parts of the country. So it's up and running a good few years now, and then under that, I suppose, as I said, the limitations around these soils, lots of rainfall as we can get into, and difficult soils, but trying to get rid of that excess water, so land drainage, and then I suppose other issues raise their heads in terms of the usual questions in terms of grassland management, soil fertility come into it, managing the winter and managing fodder reserves and all that comes into it in trickier times of the year, and all those issues. So there's a number of things under the heavy soils umbrella, I suppose, and it has been a very positive program in terms of the collaboration between various different regions in the country, the advisory regions and the research side of things. So it has been, I suppose, a mark of the success of it has been that it has been running a good few years and still gets a good lot of attention in when the weather gets a bit tricky. It certainly gets a good lot of attention.
Absolutely, none different this spring. And just you have a number of demo farms, really. That's how the program is run. Number of demo farms.
Yeah, so we've had 10 over the years. We've consolidated a small bit. We're back to 8 at the moment, and those are spread around the country. So Cavan, Monaghan, Mayo in its time, West Clare, West Limerick, Kerry, Cork, Tipperary. You know, so as I said, we've concentrated more so in those regions. Where and the Kerry region is an example where a lot of the farms have been based, where a good share or a large proportion of the suppliers are impacted in terms of difficult soils. So, but there's a good spread, I suppose, nationally, and it's heavy soils and high rainfall areas, generally speaking.
Yeah, I was just looking at a publication there you had a couple of years ago in terms of kind of key learnings or key lessons from the program, and some of the progress made, and I suppose the title of this is really setting up for Grazing Success, but on average, I think growing maybe 9 or 10 ton, a lot of these farms at the start of the program, and you know, it's at 12 or 13 ton now. Maybe we'll come to the grazing and the utilization piece in a moment, but because it's one thing growing the grass, but it's another thing actually getting it into cows. But the soil fertility, if you were just to say, I suppose, in terms of, there was an awful lot of emphasis put in the program on improving soil fertility. Just comment on that maybe. And
yeah, and we had others in the program. So Ger Courtney would have taken a lead on this, and David Corbett was a student we had around for a while. I suppose the issue around fertility was that it was very poor. When we first started looking at it in detail, we sampled every paddock and every farm at the end of 2013. And it's safe to say that the results were poor. At the time, nationally, about 10% of the paddocks being sampled were optimum for pH, P and K, and we were at about 2%. So I think we sampled 300 paddocks, and there was 6 of them that were optimum. So that since that time, we're up to about 30% now, 31 or 2% actually, when the national figure is somewhere around 20%. So we've gone from being well behind the curve to a good bit ahead of it now. Obviously, there's still ground to be made up there, but the nature of these soils, the rainfall is an issue in terms of pH, but in terms of the soil chemistry, there's an issue in terms of high clay content soils with iron and aluminium, and the potential they have for holding on to phosphorus that's applied obviously by the farmer with a view that it would be plant available, but it's not ultimately with the way the chemistry works. So that has been a battle and something that has, I suppose, had us pulling our hair out at times over the years, and still to this day, there's certain paddocks or certain parts and certain farms that we you know, they just don't play ball. It's not that they're not getting the nutrient, or the problem isn't being recognized. It's just that they're trying to get around that chemistry that's holding up the phosphorus. In particular, phosphorus is an issue. And with the Ks as well, I suppose there's an issue there with Ks jumping around a lot, you know, being high in one year and low in the next, and that having an impact on overall fertility. But unfortunately, there's no silver bullet here. There's no overnight cure. It's just a matter of keeping the shoulder to the wheel and trying to, I suppose, what David Corbett's work would have shown is there's certain parts of the farm that respond better than others. And it's trying to get those right, and concentrate where you're going to see a return. And that has been a lesson across the board in the program in terms of investing more, having a more targeted investment, I suppose, in terms of be it the fertility or be it the drainage or the infrastructure or what have you. You know, putting in something that will get a return, really.
Is that the main message there, Pat, around that soil fertility, in terms of know where you're at? I suppose there's been big emphasis in the program correcting pH anyway, because it's the cheapest one to do as such in terms of the product that's required. And then, as you say, there's X amount of an allowance, there's X amount of money available in terms of then putting your P's and K's where you're getting that best return, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's absolutely no excuse, and all the data has shown that over the years. We've continued that program of sampling every paddock. Once you get the lime out, the pH will come with you and will rise. You know, so there's a straight away a cause and an effect there, if you want to look at it that way. Whereas phosphorus, as I said, doesn't necessarily always play ball. So pH certainly can be improved. They can all be improved. It's just, as I said, it's a longer slog for the P's and the K's.
But I think throughout the program too, as you say, it's been a matter of keeping the faith as such, targeting the correct areas and not falling off. Like, there is the risk, I suppose, with the prices of fertilizer, P's and K's probably not falling at the same rate as nitrogen, that maybe even maintenance levels aren't going out on farm, and it's just something we need to be careful of, and for our viewers to.
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. I think that's a key point where we've seen it, where, you know, you can get these nutrient levels can drop fairly dramatically in a year or two, and might take 10 years then to recover with all the will in the world, you know. So that's something to bear in mind. It might be a short-term financial gain, but in the long run, to get back up to the level you're at, it's not going to be cheap, you know.
Yeah, very good. Obviously then, soil fertility, along with reseeding, has driven a fair bit of that productivity. But utilization is usually the issue on these farms. Where are the farms at? We'll come to this spring in a moment, but in terms of grazing season length, improvements in that, how did you set about? Because that's the challenge on these heavy soils farms, just looking 1700 mil of rain on average on some of these farms. It's tough going.
Yeah, and look, we can talk about this spring or any spring, but like as I said, we've been around a while now, and anyone who's in these areas, there is no ideal spring. Maybe 2020 came close, but every spring has been challenging. And even this year, February was dry and played ball, March didn't, but there's been plenty of years where neither were amenable to doing a whole lot. So, those challenges are there. We had a farm that got the farm in Kishgame in North Cork got, and there's weather stations in all these farms. We've got 1,050 mil in the 6 months from the 1st of October. Just gone. So, and that's not the first time it's happened, and it won't be the last. So it's a typical year's rain in the eastern half of the country. So you have to work within that. And I suppose in terms of targets and increasing utilization, I suppose if the underlying, I suppose, makeup of the farm in terms of fertility is poor, or drainage isn't right, or infrastructure isn't there, you can have all the targets you want, and they won't come to pass, I suppose. So it's getting all those different elements right, and then having the guy to open the gate. And this year was an example of that, and it has been the case with the lads, in fairness, the last number of years. Getting into that mindset of when the opportunities are there to be determined to use them, And February this year was a classic example. Once you go out, then it's easier to kind of see the days when there's opportunities to go out, I suppose.
And talk to me about that, and we'll come back to the infrastructure a bit in a minute, but like over the last 10, 12 years of the programme, the attitude of the farmers in the programme, I would say, has changed dramatically, Pat, in terms of, you grab grazings when you can type of thing, which often on these heavy soils, look, I have a heavy farm, the idea of grazing in February, but conditions were perfect this February type of thing. Yet some farmers maybe didn't get out, you know what I mean? Because traditionally they wouldn't. Just how is farmer attitude, I suppose, and if you were to, what percentage of the gains, I suppose, is coming down to farmer attitude, and we'll come to infrastructure then.
Yeah, there's you could argue that there's an awful lot of it, really, James. It's, as I said, you can have the infrastructure and have the work done, but it's opening the gate. There is and even in March when things were poor, the lads were determined if the days came. Look, some days came and wasn't the opportunity, but other times they might get them out for 3 hours, and they might get them out for 4 hours. And look, we know the advantages of that. You're in and out. There's more work involved, but you're getting as much as you would maybe with a full day out. So it's taking those opportunities, and it's seeing where the opportunities are. But it marries in. I suppose you can't really talk about one without the other. Like if parts of the farm are totally inaccessible, the opportunity disappears fairly quickly. Simple things and relatively cheap things to invest in, farm roadways and spur roadways and simple things that we've been banging on about for years. When you actually step back at times, there is parts of lots of farms that are still, fairly poorly served with roadways and access.
Yeah, so and that's something that you've placed a lot of effort on, obviously, which like infrastructure audits or infrastructure wish lists, or I don't know what you want to call them.
Yeah, and those were done by I suppose, by the advisors in the region at the time, or some discussion groups were involved as well. And it's just maybe bringing in a fresh set of eyes and asking that question: what parts of the farm are well catered for, and what parts of the farm aren't? And very, like I said, very simple things. A spur roadway here and there, an extra access point here and there. Marrying that up, I suppose. Look, we had the advantage in the program that the soils were mapped in detail and surveyed in detail and monitored over the years in terms of soil type and soil chemistry and everything else. So, but on any farm, it's itemizing where the areas are that are worth accessing in those kind of in between times when things are starting to dry a bit and there's opportunities. There's some parts of the farm you can write off entirely maybe, and you'll be waiting until maybe, you know, the last couple of weeks in the current year, and they weren't even right in February, and that's fine. But there's plenty of areas that, you know, that will take a bit of traffic and can be managed if the attitude is there that, well, first of all, the work is done and the access is there. The drainage work is maybe done if that's lacking, the fertility is looked at, but that the opportunity then is grabbed when the chance comes, because, you know, as sure as night follows day, there's no, as I said, every spring has been challenging. There's no, you know, ideal conditions where it stops, where it stops raining at the end of January and we have a good run at it then for the rest of the spring. It's not realistic, you know.
Yeah. The reality is that these farms spend a lot of time on off graze and grabbing single grazings where they can, when possibly other farms in drier parts of the country, cows could be out full time. These guys, as you said, they could be trying to get 3 or 4 hours grass into cows. Coming back to the infrastructure audit, right? You're looking for areas of the farm that you said maybe isn't well served in terms of access. Any pointers for viewers in terms of, I know you were looking at paddock size, paddock shape, access. Just talk to me about the importance of maybe those things as well.
Yeah, and I suppose it's paddock size comes into it, I suppose, in terms of, and we've seen that as herds have got a bit bigger, there hasn't been necessarily the same follow up, and paddocks are given poor allocations at times, or there's herds being kind of a couple of rows being left out of a parlour to go back to yesterday's paddock and this kind of crack, which adds a bit of labour in places. But I think it's mostly got to do with access. You know, assessing the bigger paddocks in particular. How far is the extreme end of a paddock away from the roadway network? You know, putting in a spur roadway, which might only be, you know, 1.5 meters, 2 meters wide, sacrifice a strip along the edge of the paddock and run that halfway into the paddock. You know, again, it's not rocket science, any of this stuff, but it's just to take out the farm map and you know, look at the roadways and walk the roadways and assess, particularly those bigger paddocks. And it's something that we kind of pictured. There's a, you know, the roadway network runs up to whatever area of the farm and connects in with this paddock and that paddock, but the far end of those paddocks might be a long way, might be, you know, 250, 300 meters away from a roadway, which is a long distance in wet weather.
And talk to me about that distance, because I know you have figures there in terms of on these heavy paddocks, how far, I suppose, and that's a simple one for people, from the end of the roadway as such to the end of the paddock. What are we, in an ideal world, Pat, and nothing's ever ideal, but
around 50 to 100 meters, James, would be what we'd be talking about. And that sounds very tight in some circumstances. And when you assess the farm in that light, you'll find that there's a lot of areas well beyond that, generally speaking. But, you know, those extra grazings, the on-off grazing and the management of that, look, the soils have to be suitable, they might have to be drained or drainage work done, and all the rest of it has to be right. But, you know, an extra bit of investment in terms of, like I described, fairly straightforward bits of infrastructure in terms of spur roadways opens the door to those areas of the farm that otherwise, you know, wouldn't be in play at the times of the year we're talking about, the shoulders of the year or any time of the year if the weather comes wrong, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I know I did this with a discussion group recently, and I called it an infrastructure wish list as such. But some of these farms had a significant amount of work to do, I suppose. It's not that all has to be done tomorrow. Like, you know, these can be 3, 4, 5 year programs, whatever they are. Like, do all these need to be 4 meter wide roadways? Like, just maybe talk us through that in terms of, I suppose it's important that you have a plan, but ultimately, I suppose there's only so much can be done in a given time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and it was, I suppose a lot of that work was done at, you know, this time 5 years ago now, after the 2018 spring, when, and 18 is remembered for the very hot, dry weather in the summer, but it can be forgotten in some quarters that the spring was extremely wet. And those issues were highlighted in some cases, and highlighted fairly drastically, that the farms that were well set up, as I described in terms of access, performed reasonably well and took the opportunities when they came. The farms that weren't, then, you know, there was simple things that we looked at. So it was going out and, like you say, James, prioritizing and it wasn't a 6-month plan, it was maybe a 4 or 5 year plan, and say, look, you could do with an extra roadway in that part of the farm, you know, which might be the full lot, you know, in terms of a 4 or 5 meter wide roadway to a main kind of artery or main avenue. But most of the time that wasn't the case. It was smaller roads. It was more rudimentary kind of stuff that would, you know, access extreme corners or the extremities of the farm that weren't that well serviced. And saying, right, if we were to do work in 2018, 2019, 2020, you know, over the next couple of years, what would those priorities be? And it's look, it maximizes your opportunities then to look to play the hand you're dealt, I suppose, so to speak, in terms of where those opportunities are, and getting at those areas when the chance presents itself, you know.
There's a question in there in terms of the roadway infrastructure now is covered under TAMS 3, so there's an opportunity there maybe for farms that have a significant amount of this work to do, that they may actually get grant aid on that. Just a comment around the specifications. Are they that different than what you would be recommending, Pat, or what the guys on the program would have put in over the years?
No, there's a document there that the department have put up, which is reflects fairly clearly what we've been putting together and what others, I suppose, we had pulled from previous work that was done in Kildalton places, in terms of the spec of the roadways. As you say, there's potential for TAMS grants there now in terms of roadways and underpasses as well, as it happens. So, but look, most of these will be fairly relatively cheap investments, and even without grant aid, to be honest, the return that's available for investing in roadways is fairly strong. And as you said, the specs are there. There's booklets that were produced the last number of years on infrastructure. There's detailed in the Department of Ag specification there now, which goes into detail as well. And it's the specification to a degree looks after itself. It's the thinking has to be done is where and what parts of the farm are lacking, and if we were to go putting in, you know, 500 meters of road in the next 3 summers, where would that go, and what would the farm look like, and what would access look like after those 3 years? And you know, come to spring 24, spring 25, there's not going to be any easy spring coming on difficult soils. We know that's the one thing we can guarantee, as I said earlier. So, you know, in a more ideal scenario, what way would we manage that if we had you know, an extra couple of tons of gravel coming in and putting them somewhere productive? Is really what it's about.
Okay, we've been talking about getting cows to grass, and we've been very positive about putting the right infrastructure in place. And but the reality is, and not to be too downbeat, Pat, that some days, as you say, you just can't get the grass. Conditions don't allow. Silage quality and quantity of that is probably something over the duration of the program that guys have focused on. And the reality is that cows are going to be milking off silage for particular periods, let that be in the spring and the shoulder. Just a comment on that, because there was a comment the other day in terms of, you know, people on heavy soils can't make quality silage type of thing.
Yeah, look, I mean, the same rules apply. It's getting it cut at the right stage of the year and managing around that, and those rules don't change just because there's heavier soils in play. And yeah, I suppose we don't want to paint a picture that it's all rosy here. Like, you know, in the heavy soils program, we probably had on average a third of the farms grazed by the end of February, but that had only gone up to about 50% by the middle of April. So that tells its own story. Like, March wasn't cooperating, generally speaking. So it's managing around that then, and having good quality silage. The lads have shown, you know, as I said, the same rules apply, getting the silage cut at the right time and ensuring quality as opposed to bulk. Those rules apply again, and the lads have shown, you know, very high quality silage being being reserved on these farms and having those reserves and again there's rules of thumb out there in terms of allowing for extra reserves for a very poor year and having that in the bank, so to speak, and again that has been part of the program, that you have those options, that you're not forced to open the gate, that the option is there to if it's there to take it, but if it's not, that there's alternatives to keeping them in and maintaining them.
Yeah, that's a good point in terms of not only silage quality, but also the quantity that's in the yard. Like these farms is not good in any system in terms of maybe running to the wire in terms of silage stocks. But the reality is that these guys do carry for those periods where very quickly they can run into difficult periods, as you say, where silage might have to be fed.
Yeah, and especially the way, and we look back again, like if you look at October, November, they were wetter than March. In March, we've a more recent view of, so maybe we're looking at that way. But like the winter started relatively early, and February was a blessing then to let things happen a bit sooner. But then March turned back on things again. So look, as I said, there is no. That's one thing we can guarantee. There is no easy spring coming. There's always going to be plenty of water around, no matter what we try to do to avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the focus on those farms, Pat, really now, as you say, look at, got a great run in February. Things were very, very difficult in March and into early April. The focus of those farms now, a lot of them, is that really the same as what John was saying, correct farm cover, get cows back into 1300, 1400. We've spent a lot of time focusing on the spring or the autumn or the difficult conditions, but I'm just looking, these guys are doing 30, 40 grass walks a year. Mid-season, they're doing as good a job as anyone in terms of getting cows into the right covers.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think they're something similar to what John's figures were. They're about 720, 730 now covers, and growth has lifted. The walks that were done this week are showing growths of in around 50s, whereas they were 20s and 25s last week. So that lift is coming with the slight increase in temperatures. So yeah, it's about managing that going forward and into as you said, looking forward to silage cuts and all that goes with it in terms of maintaining the reserves and the good quality reserves that they've tended to have over the last few winters.
Very good. Look, I think we'll leave it at that. Ultimately, I suppose, Pat, what I'm taking is we have the main things around grazing success and the success of these farmers in the program has been maybe number one, farmer attitude, as you said, but ultimately making sure soil fertility receded towards good grazing infrastructure. And that's the one maybe we'd encourage viewers to just sit down with a map, have a look at their farm, let that be with your advisor, with maybe a number of farming neighbours, discussion groups, whatever it is, put a wish list together. And really then I suppose it's about managing that grass, doing your grass walks as best you can and not letting the weather dictate that. So look, thanks a million, Pat, appreciate the time. Next week we have Pádraig O'Connor on, and Pádraig's going to be discussing milking skills and skills in the parlour. So thanks a million, folks, and farm safely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks, James.